It had been a long, uneventful night for Henry, a 70-year-old taxi driver who had spent decades behind the wheel, ferrying strangers across the city's dimly lit streets. The rain drummed steadily against his windshield, blurring the neon reflections of gas stations, late-night diners, and empty storefronts. It was the kind of night that made a man feel his age, made the bones ache a little more than usual, made the memories from the past slip in like whispers through the cold drafts creeping into the cab. Henry wasn't supposed to be out this late anymore. Julia, his late wife, had always told him to take it easy after retirement, but retirement didn't pay the bills. His pension was barely enough to keep up with rent, and his grown children were too busy with their own lives to check in on him more than once or twice a year. So he worked, driving strangers from one place to another, each ride blending into the next, just faces in the rearview mirror, just voices that faded the moment the doors slammed shut. But that night, something different happened. Something that would change everything. Just as he was thinking of calling it quits, the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, announcing a last-minute fare. Pick up on 8th and Holloway. Male passenger. Urgent request. Henry sighed, rubbing his tired eyes before flipping on his signal and pulling onto the main road. He didn't usually like taking last-minute calls, especially not on nights like these. Last-minute calls were trouble, drunks, people who didn't want to pay, or worse, people looking for someone to rob. But work was work. When he pulled up to the corner, the street was nearly deserted, save for a single man standing beneath a flickering streetlight, his dark coat soaked from the rain. Even in the dim light, Henry could see something off about him. He was nervous, shifting from foot to foot, one hand clutching a large, weathered suitcase as if it contained something precious. Henry had seen all types over the years, but there was something about this one that made his gut tighten. The man hesitated before opening the door and sliding into the back seat, his movements sharp, quick, deliberate. Where to? Henry asked, glancing at the man in the rearview mirror. The passenger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled heavily like he had just run a marathon, then muttered an address that Henry didn't recognize. Somewhere on the far edge of the city, an industrial area where most of the warehouses had been abandoned years ago. Henry hesitated for a split second, but then shifted into drive. He had driven through worse places before. The man leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. No stops, no detours, and drive fast. There was an edge in his voice, something just shy of a threat but firm enough that Henry didn't argue. As the cab moved through the wet streets, the only sound was the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers and the occasional patter of water dripping from the man's coat onto the seat. Henry didn't ask questions. It wasn't his job to care where people were going or why they were in such a hurry. But his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of the passenger's face. A man in his 40s, maybe, with tired eyes and a jaw set tight, like he was holding back something heavy. And then there was the suitcase, always within arm's reach, fingers gripping the handle, so tight the knuckles had turned white. They drove in silence for nearly 20 minutes, the city lights growing dimmer as they moved toward the outskirts. Henry could feel the tension thickening in the cab, an invisible weight pressing against his chest. He had been driving long enough to know when a man was running from something. And this man, he wasn't just running. He was hiding. As they neared the destination, the man suddenly straightened, his body tense, his breathing shallow. "Pull over here," he said sharply. It wasn't the address he had given earlier, just a random stretch of road near an old overpass. Henry slowed the car, but didn't stop immediately. "You sure?" "There's nothing out here," he said, glancing at the man again. But the passenger wasn't looking at him anymore. He was staring at something in the distance, his hand now gripping the suitcase like a lifeline. "Just stop," the man ordered. His voice had changed, now more desperate, more afraid. Henry had seen enough in his years to know when a man was about to do something stupid, Before he could say anything else, the man threw open the door, stepped out into the rain, and vanished into the night, the sound of his hurried footsteps disappearing into the darkness. The cab's interior light flickered off as the door slammed shut, leaving Henry sitting there stunned, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. He turned his head to look at the back seat, expecting to see nothing but damp upholstery and the faint imprint of where the man had sat. But that wasn't all that was there. The suitcase. The man had left it behind. Henry stared at it for a long moment, his breath catching in his throat. It was old, leather-bound, the kind people used to travel with decades ago. But it was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. Something about the weight, about the way the man had held onto it so fiercely, made Henry's stomach twist. He reached out hesitantly, his fingertips brushing against the damp leather. For a moment, he thought about driving straight to the nearest police station. That would be the smart thing to do. Report it, let someone else deal with whatever mess that passenger was tangled up in. But as his fingers tightened around the handle, something stopped him. Call it curiosity. Call it instinct. Or maybe, just maybe, it was fate. Because the moment Henry opened that suitcase, he knew his life would never be the same again. Henry sat there, gripping the suitcase's handle, his fingers curling around the worn leather as though it might lunge at him if he let go. The weight of it wasn't just physical. It carried something more, something unseen but undeniably powerful. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave it alone, to take it straight to the police and be done with it. But a stronger, quieter voice whispered something else. A lifetime of regret, of chances not taken, of mysteries left unsolved had carved deep lines into his face. How many times had he told himself he didn't care? That his job was just to drive, to get people from point A to point B without asking questions? But this was different. This wasn't a lost umbrella or a forgotten phone. This was something else entirely. His pulse quickened. His breathing shallowed. And before he could stop himself, he reached for the clasps. The suitcase opened with a soft click, the sound almost lost beneath the steady drumming of rain on the car's roof. Stacks of crisp $100 bills stared back at him, neatly arranged in tight bundles, their edges still sharp, untouched by time. Henry let out a sharp breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. It had to be at least $500,000, maybe more, all packed neatly into a case that had been left in his back seat as if it were nothing. His first thought was that it had to be drug money. Nothing else made sense. But before he could even process the cash, his eyes caught something else. A small stack of letters, yellow with age, tied together with a frayed ribbon. Unlike the money, these weren't neatly placed. They looked tossed in forgotten, as if they hadn't been touched in decades. His hands shook slightly as he picked them up, the paper brittled between his fingers. The ink had faded, but the name on the first letter made his breath catch in his throat. Eleanor. The name felt familiar, though he couldn't place it immediately, like a tune from an old song he had once known but couldn't hum anymore. The postmark was dated over 50 years ago, stamped from a small town Henry barely remembered. He ran his thumb over the name, something in his chest tightening, pulling at old, buried things. He flipped to the next letter, skimming the first few lines. The words dripped with sorrow, with longing, with something left unfinished. Eleanor, I never wanted to leave. You have to believe me. There are things you don't know, things I never told you. If I could change it, I would. But some choices aren't ours to make. Henry swallowed hard. The handwriting was eerily familiar. He didn't understand why, not yet, but he knew deep in his bones that these letters mattered. He shuffled through them, looking for more clues, but something else caught his attention, a photograph tucked between the pages. He pulled it out carefully, wiping a shaky hand over his damp jeans before holding it up to the dim light of the street lamp outside. A young woman, no older than 20, stared back at him, her eyes bright with something between defiance and sadness. She was beautiful in a way that people were in old photographs, timeless, almost untouchable. Next to her, partially out of frame, stood a man, his face mostly obscured. Henry squinted, trying to make out the details, but something about the image unnerved him. There was something he couldn't put his finger on, a familiarity just out of reach. And then there was the gun. It was wrapped in cloth, buried beneath the stacks of money, as if someone had wanted to keep it close but hidden. Henry's breath hitched. The gun was old but well-maintained, the kind of weapon that didn't get tossed around lightly. The kind that had a history. The kind that had been used. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. Just looking at it sent a chill down his spine. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The money, the letters, the gun. It all pointed to something bigger, something dangerous. And yet, the presence of the letters, the faded ink, the name Eleanor, they pointed to something deeply personal. Henry had spent a lifetime avoiding the past, pretending it didn't matter, that old wounds healed if you ignore them long enough. But now, sitting in his cab, the past had found him. And it wasn't letting go. He closed the suitcase, his hands gripping the edges tightly as if to steady himself. He had two choices, two roads diverging in a rain. The first was simple. Take the suitcase to the police, tell them he had no idea what was inside, walk away, and forget this night ever happened. But the second choice, that was harder. That meant asking questions, following the trail, digging into things that had been buried for half a century. It meant finding out why Eleanor's name was in that suitcase, why that photograph felt like it was a ghost from his own past, why that passenger had left it behind as if he wanted Henry to find it. Henry had always told himself he wasn't the kind of man who went looking for trouble. He had been a factory worker before this, husband, a father, a simple man who kept his head down and did what needed to be done. But maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about trouble. Maybe this was about something else, something unfinished, something meant for him. The rain fell harder, beating against the windshield like an impatient drum. He turned on the wipers, his gaze locking onto his own reflection in the rearview mirror. What would Julia have told him to do? He could almost hear her voice, soft but firm, the way she used to say his name when she knew he was thinking too much. Henry, you always let the past scare you. But maybe it's time to face it. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He had spent 70 years waiting for life to tell him what to do, waiting for fate to make decisions for him. But this was his choice. And for the first time in a long, long time, he wanted to know the truth. Without another thought, he shifted the car into drive and pulled onto the road, the suitcase still sitting on the seat beside him. He wasn't turning this into the police. Not yet. First, he needed to find Eleanor. And that was a road he had never expected to travel. Henry had spent his whole life avoiding ghosts, sidestepping the questions that loomed too large, brushing past the edges of things too painful to examine. But now, sitting behind the wheel of his cab, the rain smearing neon lights across his windshield, he realized something unsettling. This wasn't a ghost chasing him. It was the past finally catching up. He had spent 70 years pretending that some questions didn't need answers, that some roads weren't meant to be walked. But tonight, fate had thrown a suitcase full of money, a gun, and a bundle of forgotten letters into his lap, and it wasn't about to let him turn away. The name Eleanor sat heavy on his tongue, as foreign as it was familiar, a whisper from a life he had never lived but somehow belonged to. Who was she to him? And why did her name, written in those faded letters, feel like it was tied to something unfinished? Henry wasn't the kind of man who knew where to start looking for people. His world had always been small, his wife, his kids, a handful of co-workers from the factory who had long since moved away or passed on. But life had a way of forcing you to remember things you thought you'd buried. He pulled into a gas station, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, and reached for the stack of letters again. He hadn't dared read more than a few words back in the cab, but now, under the harsh glow of buzzing lights, he unfolded one carefully, his hands trembling just slightly. Eleanor, I never wanted to leave. They told me it was for the best, but I knew the best was staying with you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I never forgot. And I never stopped trying to come back. The words hit Henry like a hammer to the chest, not because of what they said, but because of something deeper, something buried in the edges of his memory. The handwriting, it was familiar. Not in a way he could place immediately, but in a way that sent a slow, cold realization curling through him. Had he seen it before? Had he held a letter like this decades ago, when he was just a boy, staring at an envelope his mother refused to open? He swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep reading, flipping through the letters, searching for anything, a last name, an address, a clue. And then there it was, scrawled on the back of an old yellowed envelope, barely legible under the smudged ink, with an address. It wasn't far, just outside the city, near the river, where the land was cheap and people went to disappear. Henry's gut twisted. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find when he got there, but he knew he had to go. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time Henry pulled onto the long, cracked driveway of Riverside Care Home, the kind of place that existed in the spaces people forgot about. The kind of place where the elderly were tucked away like unfinished chapters, their stories waiting for someone to come back and turn the page. Henry sat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the flickering porch light. If Eleanor was here, she wasn't young anymore. The girl from the photograph, the one with bright, defiant eyes, was long gone. What remained? And would she even remember him? He wasn't sure why that thought hit him so hard. Was she supposed to? He didn't even know who she was to him. But there was something pulling him forward, something more than curiosity. He stepped out of the cab, the cold air biting through his thin jacket, and walked toward the door. The receptionist barely glanced up when he asked for Eleanor. Room 214, she said, pointing down a long hallway, her voice flat with the kind of exhaustion that came from working too many shifts in a place full of people waiting to die. Henry's heart pounded as he stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the scent of old paper, antiseptic, and something faintly floral hanging in the air. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he wasn't ready for what he found. She was sitting by the window, her silver hair cascading in soft waves down her back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't frail, not in the way Henry had seen some elderly people crumble under the weight of time. There was something in her posture, an old strength, something unbroken. But when she turned to look at him, her eyes, those eyes from the photograph, older but still holding that same fire, froze him in place. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then softly, she said, "I was wondering when someone would come." Henry blinked. She had been expecting this. His throat tightened. I don't know where to start." Eleanor studied him, her gaze sharp, assessing, as if she was trying to decide whether he was a man she could trust. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached out a hand, old but steady, and motioned for him to sit. "Start with the suitcase," she said. Henry sat, the weight of the case between them. And for the first time in 70 years, he realized that this wasn't just a mystery to be solved. This was the key to a door that had been locked for a lifetime. For a long moment, Henry sat there, gripping the suitcase as if it might disappear if he let go, his pulse thrumming beneath the thin skin of his wrist. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of a television playing in the hallway and the faint sound of rain tapping against the window. Eleanor watched him with an expression that was impossible to read, not quite surprise, not quite recognition, but something deeper, something old. The weight of her gaze made Henry's chest tighten, and for a moment he felt like a child again, staring up at a world too big, too complex to understand. He had come here looking for answers, but suddenly he wasn't sure he wanted to hear them. She motioned to the suitcase. "You opened it, didn't you?" Her voice was quiet but firm, like someone who had spent a lifetime carrying the burden of knowing too much. Henry swallowed. "Yeah, I did." She nodded slowly, her fingers twitching slightly against the armrest of her chair. "Then you've seen the letters." It wasn't a question. She already knew. Henry hesitated, his grip tightening on the handle of the case. "Who wrote them?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. He didn't realize how much he feared the answer until the words were already out in the open, hovering between them like a thick fog. Eleanor took a slow breath, her eyes never leaving his face. "I think you already know, Henry." And just like that, the world tilted beneath him. He felt it before he truly understood it, a shift in his chest, a sudden and undeniable ache of recognition. His mind scrambled for a way to reject it, to make it something else, anything else. But there was no escaping the truth, not anymore. The handwriting, the name, the letters. He had seen them before, tucked away in an old shoebox in his mother's closet, hidden under a pile of forgotten belongings. He had been just a boy then, too young to understand why she cried when she thought he wasn't looking. Too young to ask why she never spoke about the man who had left them behind. His stomach turned. "You're saying," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought, to make it real. Eleanor didn't flinch. "The man who wrote those letters, he was your father, Henry." The words hit him like a blow to the chest, knocking the air from his lungs. His father. A man he had spent his whole life not knowing. A ghost in the background of his childhood, nothing more than a shadow his mother refused to speak of, a missing piece he had long since stopped trying to find. And now here he was, sitting in front of a woman who had known him, who had loved him. And she had known about Henry too. He shook his head, his throat tightening. "That doesn't make sense." But the moment he said it, he knew it wasn't true. It made perfect sense. Too much sense. Eleanor exhaled, rubbing her temples as if the weight of the past was suddenly too much to bear. "Your father and I, we were supposed to have a life together. A long time ago. But things didn't work out that way." She hesitated, her fingers ghosting over the letters in his lap. "He made choices, Henry. Choices I didn't understand back then. Maybe I still don't." Henry's heart pounded in his ears. "Where is he?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, before he could even think about whether or not he wanted the answer. Eleanor hesitated, then looked away, her gaze settling somewhere beyond the window, into a past only she could see. "Gone." The word sent an ache through his ribs, a dull hollow pain he didn't know what to do with. Gone. That could mean 1,000 things, but Henry already knew the truth wasn't what he wanted to hear. "He was looking for you," Eleanor said after a long silence. "All those years. He never stopped." Henry felt something hot and bitter rise in his throat. "Then why didn't he find me?" Eleanor met his gaze, and there was something there, regret maybe, or pity, because by the time he could, it was too late. The room felt too small, too quiet. Henry's chest ached with something he didn't have a name for. He had spent 70 years thinking his father had left because he didn't care, because he had chosen another life over the one they could have had. But now he wasn't sure what to believe. The suitcase, the letters, the gun, they all pointed to something so much more complicated than he had ever imagined. He forced himself to take a breath. "Why was his suitcase in my cab, Eleanor?" Eleanor hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "Because someone wanted you to find it." A chill ran down his spine. The passenger. Henry clenched his fists. Who was he? Eleanor's gaze flickered, but she didn't answer. And that was all Henry needed to know. She recognized him. Something bigger was at play here, something that stretched across decades, across lives left unfinished and choices that could never be undone. He didn't know what he was supposed to do with any of this, but one thing was clear: his father had spent his whole life searching for something. And now it was Henry's turn to do the same. Henry had spent his life believing his father was nothing more than an absence, a missing name on forms, a space left blank in conversations that his mother refused to have. But now, in the dim light of Eleanor's small room, surrounded by letters that should have never existed in a suitcase full of questions, that story was beginning to unravel. His father hadn't just left, he had disappeared. And not by choice. The weight of it pressed down on Henry's chest, heavy and suffocating, like the air before a storm. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear more, but something inside him, something old, something hungry, refused to let him turn away. Eleanor sighed, her fingers ghosting over the letters, her eyes distant. "Your father never stopped loving you, Henry," she said softly. "He never wanted to leave. He was forced to." The words settled over him like a blanket of cold. Forced. He swallowed hard. By who? Eleanor hesitated, her expression tightening. By people who had no intention of letting him come back. Henry's mind raced. "You mean the police?" It was the obvious answer. A suitcase full of cash, a gun, a man who vanished without a trace. It all screamed crime, danger, something ugly that couldn't be undone. But Eleanor shook her head. No, Henry. Not the police. Someone worse. A chill crawled up his spine. She took a breath, as if steadying herself before speaking again. "Your father was involved in something he never should have been. Not because he wanted to be, but because he didn't have a choice. He owed a debt, dangerous one. And when the time came to pay, he couldn't. So they took the only thing they could." Henry's throat tightened. His life. Eleanor looked away, her silence speaking louder than words. He felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. His father hadn't just left. He had been taken. Erased. Buried beneath the weight of a past Henry had never known existed. And yet, somehow, he had still spent his final years trying to reach back, trying to find the son he had lost. Henry's breath came shallow, uneven. "How do you know all this?" Eleanor closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "Because I was the last person he tried to contact before he disappeared for good." Henry stiffened. "You're saying he was alive for years?" She nodded. "He was running, Henry. Always running. Trying to stay ahead of people who wouldn't let him rest. Trying to figure out how to get back to you without putting you in danger." She hesitated, then met his gaze. He always thought they were watching. Even at the end, a shiver ran through him. "And you think they still are?" Eleanor's eyes darkened. "I think some debts never get forgotten." Henry let out a slow, shaking breath. He had spent 70 years thinking his father had simply walked away, that he had chosen a life without them. But that wasn't the truth, was it? The truth was uglier, harder, more complicated. His father had tried and failed. He had been hunted, forced into a life he couldn't escape, and in the end, he had paid the price. And now, somehow, it had found Henry, too. His hands curled into fists. The passenger, the man who had left the suitcase in his cab, knew all of this. That wasn't an accident. That was a message. Eleanor watched him carefully. "You need to be careful, Henry." He shook his head. "No. I need to find out who that man was, and why he wanted me to know all of this." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you're going to have to go further than I ever could." Henry clenched his jaw. He had spent his entire life telling himself that the past didn't matter, that some stories weren't meant to be told. But now he wasn't sure he had a choice, because the story wasn't finished, and neither was he. Henry had spent the better part of his life believing that fate was something that happened to other people. It was something written in books, played out in the grand tragedies of history, whispered in the kind of stories old men told over cheap whiskey in dimly lit bars. But sitting here now in the quiet hush of Eleanor's small room, with $500,000 sitting in the suitcase at his feet and the weight of a dead man's choices pressing against his chest, he could feel it curling around him, tightening like an unseen hand. This was fate. It had found him in the form of a nervous stranger in the back seat of his cab. It had forced its way into his hands with brittle letters and the ghost of a father he had spent a lifetime pretending he didn't need. And now it was staring him down, waiting for a decision that could never be undone. The money. It sat there, silent and undeniable, more real than anything else in the room. It was a small fortune, a sum large enough to change his life in ways he had never let himself imagine. It could buy comfort, security, a way out. He was 70 years old, still working 12-hour shifts in a taxi, still counting coins at the gas station, still skipping meals when the bills came in too high. That money could fix everything. It could erase every moment of struggle he'd endured since his wife passed, since his children stopped calling, since the world started making it clear that it had no use for old men with aching bones and nowhere left to be. But it wasn't his. In the moment that thought crossed his mind, a different kind of weight settled in his chest. He wasn't a fool. He knew what kind of money came in suitcases. This wasn't some forgotten inheritance, some stroke of good luck. This was blood money. Money that had ruined lives. Money that had gotten his father killed. Money that still carried the scent of regret and desperation in every crisp, untouched bill. If he took it, if he let himself believe, even for a second, that he deserved it, what did that make him? Eleanor seemed to hear the war raging inside his head before he could even speak. She shifted slightly in her chair, watching him, her expression knowing. "You're thinking about keeping it," she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Henry swallowed, his mouth dry. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't." A long silence stretched between them. Then Eleanor nodded, as if she had expected that. "Do you want my advice?" Henry let out a humorless laugh. "No, but I think I need it." She leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Money like that doesn't come without a cost. You think it'll buy you peace, but it won't. You think it'll take away your regrets, but it'll only give you more." She held his gaze. "The question isn't whether you could use it, Henry. The question is whether you can live with how you got it." The words cut deep, striking at something raw and unspoken inside him. Could he live with it? He thought about Julia, his wife, the only person who had ever known him better than he knew himself. He could see her now, standing at the kitchen sink, her hands wet from washing dishes, shaking her head at him with that quiet, knowing look she always had when he was about to do something he shouldn't. "Henry, you've made it 70 years without selling your soul," she would say. "Don't start now." His hands curled into fists. The truth was, he had already lost too much. He had lost his father before he ever really knew him. He had lost his wife before he was ready to let her go. He had lost the kind of life he had once dreamed about, back when he was young enough to believe that time was something that stretched on forever. But there was still one thing he hadn't lost, and that was himself. Keeping the money, choosing to profit from a history that had already stolen so much from him, would change that. And that was a price he wasn't willing to pay. But then another thought hit him, one that twisted his stomach in ways he wasn't ready for. If he didn't keep the money, where did it go? To the police? To some faceless system that would bury it in evidence rooms, divide it up in bureaucratic processes until it disappeared into the hands of people who had never suffered a day in their lives? That didn't sit right either. This money had come from something dark, something cruel, but that didn't mean it had to end that way. His father had spent his life running from the weight of it. Maybe Henry could do something different. Maybe he could turn it into something good. His mind raced, possibilities unfurling like a map before him. He thought of Eleanor, of the way her hands trembled when she reached for the letters, of the way her voice had cracked when she spoke of the past. She had spent her life waiting for something that never came. What if he could give her something else instead? He thought of the struggling families in his neighborhood, of the kids who grew up the way he had, hungry, tired, fighting for a future that always seemed just out of reach. What if this money could be something more than a relic of regret? What if it could break the cycle instead of continuing it? His chest ached with the weight of it, but for the first time since this night began, he knew what he had to do. He exhaled slowly, nodding more to himself than to Eleanor. "I'm not keeping it," he said, the words settling into his bones like a decision already made. "But I'm not wasting it either." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. "Then make sure whatever you do with it matters." And Henry knew, deep down, that he would. He had spent his whole life thinking he was just a man behind a wheel, driving through life with nothing but old regrets and quiet nights to keep him company. But maybe, just maybe, he was more than that. Maybe he still had something left to give, and that was worth more than any suitcase full of money. Henry had made up his mind about the money, but that didn't mean the story was over. If anything, it had only just begun. Because there was still one question left unanswered, the most important question of them all. Who was the man who had left the suitcase behind in his cab? Who was the passenger that had stepped into his life on that rainy night, carrying a past that didn't belong to him, and then vanished before Henry could even ask why? And why had he chosen Henry? It was a question that refused to leave him alone. It followed him in the silence of the early morning, when the streets were empty and the echoes of tires against wet pavement felt like whispers from something unseen. It followed him in the quiet hours at home, when the weight of his own past sat heavy on his chest, making it hard to breathe. And most of all, it followed him in the rearview mirror, where every shadowed street corner felt like a place where the past might be watching. He had thought at first that the man was just a stranger, a lost soul caught in something dark, running from a past that had finally caught up to him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something wasn't right. The way the man had watched him, the way he had hesitated before getting out of the car, the way he had left the suitcase, not by accident, but by choice. It wasn't random. It was intentional. And Henry needed to know why. The answer, when it finally came, didn't arrive the way he expected. It found him 4 nights later, just past midnight, when the city was at its quietest, when the only sounds left were the distant hum of late-night traffic and the occasional flicker of neon signs from the 24-hour diners that never truly closed. Henry had been parked near the same spot where he had picked up the passenger that night, his gut telling him that if he was patient enough, if he waited long enough, something would happen. And then it did. A figure stepped out of the shadows, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Henry's heart pounded. Even in the dim glow of the streetlights, he recognized him. The same coat, the same posture, the same eyes that had flickered with something unreadable in the back of his cab. Henry didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. The man hesitated, glancing once over his shoulder, as if making sure no one was following. Then he opened the passenger side door and slid into the seat beside him, the way he had the first time. Only this time he didn't have the suitcase. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, the man exhaled, his hands resting on his knees, his fingers drumming in anxious rhythm against the fabric of his coat. "You still have it?" His voice was quiet, cautious, but not surprised. He had expected Henry to keep the suitcase. Henry nodded. "Yeah." He studied the man's face, searching for something, recognition, familiarity, anything that would explain why this felt bigger than just a lost bag. "Who are you?" The man hesitated. Then slowly he turned to face Henry, his eyes tired, guarded. But beneath that, there was something else. Something that made Henry's stomach twist in a way he didn't understand. "I knew your father," the man said. Henry's breath caught. The man continued, his voice steady but filled with something heavy, something that had been carried for too long. "I knew him before he disappeared. I knew what he was running from. And I knew what he left behind." Henry swallowed hard. "Then why give me the suitcase?" The man's gaze darkened. "Because he wanted you to have it." The words sent a cold shiver down Henry's spine. He had spent his entire life believing his father had been nothing more than a ghost, a man who had walked away without looking back. But now, sitting here in the quiet of the night, he realized that wasn't true. His father had never stopped watching, never stopped searching. And this man, whoever he was proof of that. Henry's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Tell me the truth. Who are you?" The man hesitated, his fingers tightening into fists. Then, finally, he spoke. And what he said changed everything. "I'm your brother, Henry." The words hit like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from Henry's lungs. His vision blurred for a second, the city outside the windshield warping into streaks of light and shadow. He shook his head, trying to clear the sudden ringing in his ears. "That's not possible." But even as he said it, he knew it was. The man, his brother, exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Our father, he had another family. After he disappeared, after he went into hiding, he tried to start over. But he never forgot about you." He turned to face Henry fully now, his expression raw open. "He never stopped loving you. And when he realized that his time was running out, he told me to find you." Henry's chest ached, his pulse a pounding echo in his ears. He had spent his entire life thinking of his father as a man who had abandoned him. But now, sitting here, listening to a brother he never knew he had, he realized how wrong he had been. "Why now?" Henry's voice was barely above a whisper. His brother's expression tightened. "Because our father is gone, and there are still people who don't want the truth to come out." A chill ran through Henry's spine. What truth? His brother's jaw clenched. The truth about why he was running. The truth about the money. The truth about what really happened to him. He exhaled, his hand shaking slightly. "The people who took him out, Henry, they're still out there. And now they know about you." Henry's blood ran cold. The suitcase hadn't just been a message. It had been a warning. And now it was too late to turn back. Henry had always thought that when a man reached 70, he had seen all that life had to offer. The joy, the heartbreak, the quiet moments that made the years slip by like pages turning in a book too heavy to carry. But tonight, sitting in his cab with a brother he never knew he had, staring down the barrel of a truth that had been chasing him since the day he was born, he realized how little he truly knew. He had spent his life believing in one version of his story, a simple one, a painful one, but at least one he could understand. His father had been a man who left, a man who never came back, and now that story was gone, erased, rewritten. In its place stood something much harder to accept, something much more dangerous. His father had never stopped looking for him, and the people who had taken him away still had unfinished business. The weight of it all pressed against Henry's chest like an iron hand. He had spent decades behind the wheel of this taxi, watching people come and go, watching the world shift and change in the reflection of his rearview mirror. But never, not once, had he imagined that one night, a stranger would step into his cab and leave behind a secret that would change everything. He stared at the man beside him, his brother. his own flesh and blood, sitting there with the same tired eyes, the same weight of loss pulling at his shoulders. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable, and yet Henry didn't know him. How could he? They had lived separate lives, shadows in each other's pasts, and now fate had brought them here. His voice came out rough, worn. What do they want? His brother, a man who had once been a stranger but now felt like a missing part of his own history, exhaled sharply, shaking his head. They want the past to stay buried. They think you're a threat. That suitcase, it was supposed to disappear with our father. But when he knew his time was running out, he made sure I got it instead. And when I realized I was being followed, I had to get rid of it. Fast. His gaze locked onto Henry's. I left it in your cab because I knew you were the only person who deserved to know the truth. Henry let out a slow breath, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. And now? His brother's expression hardened. Now they know you have it. And they won't stop until they make sure you don't use it. The words sent a chill down Henry's spine. He had spent 70 years keeping his head down, minding his own business, surviving the only way he knew how. But now for the first time, he was standing at a crossroads with no clear way forward. He could run, walk away from this, hand the suitcase over to the police, pretend none of this had ever happened. He could stay quiet, let the past remain buried, tell himself it wasn't his problem. He could fight. He could take everything his father had left behind, the truth, the money, the regrets, the chance for something more, and use it to finish what had been started. Not for revenge, not out of anger, but because he couldn't let the past win. Because he couldn't let his father's life end as nothing more than a forgotten story in an old suitcase. His brother watched him carefully. What are you going to do, Henry? Henry closed his eyes for a long moment, letting the weight of the question settle deep into his bones. He had spent his whole life thinking he was just a man driving through the years, taking fares, watching the world pass him by. But maybe, just maybe, he had been meant for more. He opened his eyes, his decision made. I'm going to make sure they never forget my father's name. His brother nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what had just been said. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about money. It was about truth, about making things right. Henry started the engine, the low hum filling the silence between them. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would take him. He wasn't sure how this would end. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't just following the path in front of him. He was choosing it. And no matter what came next, he was ready.